How dare you humiliate my mother like that? Let her go nowhere else!
Security drags black woman off gate, and until daughter's bold move grounds flight in a way that proves sometimes the courage of one young voice can stop an entire airport and expose racism that everyone saw but nobody challenged. These tickets are fake, and you people need to step aside right now before I call security to remove you from my gate. A white gate agent's voice cut through gate C14 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport like a weapon designed specifically to wound, her finger jabbing aggressively at a 60-year-old black woman named Dorothy Freeman and her 13-year-old granddaughter Amara, who stood at the counter with boarding passes in hand, their faces showing confusion transforming rapidly into fear. As this stranger in a United Airlines uniform accused them of fraud with the kind of venom usually reserved for criminals caught in the act. You people always trying to scam your way onto flights with stolen tickets, fake credit cards, thinking nobody will check, thinking you can just waltz through here like you belong in places you clearly don't, the gate agent continued, her name tag reading Jennifer Walsh, her face twisted with a hatred so pure and unfiltered it seemed to radiate from her like heat, and I'm sick of it. Sick of dealing with your kind every single day trying to pull something. The words hit Dorothy like physical blows, each accusation landing in her chest where her heart was already racing from the stress of this trip, from worry about her younger sister Patricia who'd fallen 3 days ago and shattered her knee requiring emergency surgery that had gone poorly, who was alone in a hospital bed in Atlanta waiting for family to arrive, and Dorothy had scraped together money she didn't have to buy these tickets. Had used her credit card knowing she'd be paying interest. 4 months just to get to her sister's side, and now this woman was calling her a criminal, was saying the tickets were fake when Dorothy had confirmation emails and charge receipts and every piece of documentation proving otherwise. Ma'am, these tickets are legitimate, Dorothy said, her voice shaking but trying to stay calm the way she'd learned over 60 years of navigating a world that punished black women for showing any emotion that white people found threatening. I purchased them myself 3 days ago directly from United's website. Here's my confirmation number and my credit card statement showing the charge. Please just scan them and you'll see everything is valid. Jennifer Walsh didn't even look at the documents Dorothy held out with trembling hands, didn't acknowledge the evidence being offered, just rolled her eyes with theatrical disgust and said, I don't need to see your fake paperwork. I can spot fraudulent tickets from a mile away and yours are obviously counterfeit. The system is flagging them, which means you got them through illegal means, and I'm not letting you anywhere near that aircraft. But there was no system flagging. The boarding passes on Dorothy's phone showed standard United Airlines formatting with proper QR codes, and Amara, who was 13 and tech-savvy enough to know what legitimate tickets looked like, said quietly but firmly, ma'am, those tickets aren't flagged. We checked in online this morning without any issues. The app accepted them and generated our boarding passes. If there was a problem with payment or validity, we wouldn't have gotten this far. The logic of Amara's statement seemed to enrage Jennifer further, seemed to offend her that a black teenager would dare contradict her assessment, and she leaned forward over the counter, getting close enough that Dorothy could smell coffee on her breath, and said with slow, deliberate cruelty, don't you talk back to me, girl. I've been working this job for 15 years and I know fraud when I see it. And what I see right now is 2 people who don't belong at this gate trying to board a flight they have no business being on, probably going to cause problems once you're in the air, probably going to make demands and complaints and act like you're owed something when you're lucky we even let you in the airport. This wasn't about tickets anymore if it ever had been. This was about Jennifer Walsh exercising power over people she decided were beneath her, people whose skin color triggered something ugly in her that airport authority and a uniform gave her permission to unleash. Dorothy felt tears building behind her eyes, felt the familiar shame and rage that came from being treated like this in public while strangers watched, and she could see other passengers in the gate area staring now, phones coming out to record, people witnessing this confrontation but none of them speaking up, none of them saying this is wrong, stop treating them like this. My sister is in the hospital, Dorothy said, her voice breaking. She had emergency knee surgery and there were complications. I need to get to Atlanta to be with her. Please just check our tickets properly. We're not criminals. We're just a grandmother and granddaughter trying to get to family. But sympathy wasn't something Jennifer Walsh trafficked in, compassion wasn't part of her toolkit, and she picked up her phone with exaggerated movements and said, since you refuse to leave voluntarily, I'm calling airport security to have you removed from this gate. You can explain your fake tickets to them. This wasn't history, this wasn't something from grainy footage of the civil rights era, this was happening right now in 2025 at one of America's busiest airports where cameras and witnesses and alleged progress were supposed to mean that black people could travel without being profiled and accused and threatened. But if you think racism died somewhere between Rosa Parks and today, if you believe we've evolved past the days when black bodies were considered suspicious by default and guilty until proven innocent, then you need to understand something fundamental. It didn't disappear, it adapted, learned to wear professional uniforms and speak in policy language while wielding the same dehumanizing power. Maybe even more dangerous now because it pretends not to exist while actively destroying lives and missing final goodbyes with dying relatives and traumatizing grandmothers in front of their granddaughters who will carry these wounds forever. Dorothy had experienced racism before, had lived through segregation in her childhood and microaggressions in her adulthood, but the shock of it never quite faded. The surprise that in 60 years of living and working and contributing to society she could still be treated like this, could still have her word doubted and her humanity questioned based solely on melanin. And she looked at Amara, whose young face showed a mixture of fear and fury and something else, something that looked like determination crystallizing into action. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated and stayed silent because it wasn't your problem, keep watching, because what this 13-year-old girl does next will make you question every time you chose comfort over courage. And if you think one voice can't make a difference, if you believe speaking up is pointless when systems are rigged, drop a comment below about where you're watching from, because you need to see what happens when silence finally breaks. This story doesn't end with security dragging an elderly woman away. Hit that like button if you believe racism should have consequences, and subscribe to this channel because what's about to unfold proves that sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to be quiet. Two security officers appeared at the gate, their expressions already hardened with assumptions about who was causing problems, and Jennifer Walsh pointed at Dorothy and Amara with vindication written across her face, saying these two have fraudulent tickets and are refusing to leave the gate area. Two security officers appeared at the gate, their expressions already hardened with assumptions about who was causing problems, and Jennifer Walsh pointed at Dorothy and Amara with vindication written across her face. But to understand how we got here, how a grandmother and granddaughter ended up being accused of fraud at an airport gate while rushing to see a dying relative, we need to go back 8 hours to a small house on the south side of Chicago where this morning started not with confrontation but with love and worry and two women preparing to be there for family in crisis. Dorothy Mae Freeman, 60 years old, retired elementary school teacher who'd spent 38 years shaping young minds in Chicago public schools, sat at her kitchen table at 4:30 that morning unable to sleep, her phone clutched in arthritic hands as she reread the text message from her nephew Marcus saying Aunt Patricia's out of surgery but it didn't go well, doctors say the knee replacement got infected, she's asking for you, please come if you can. Patricia was Dorothy's baby sister, only 56 years old. The sibling she'd helped raise after their mother died young, the woman who called Dorothy every Sunday without fail, who remembered every birthday and anniversary, who'd been Dorothy's best friend for over half a century, and the thought of Patricia alone and scared in an Atlanta hospital bed made Dorothy's heart physically ache with the need to get there, to hold her sister's hand and tell her everything would be okay even if it wouldn't. Dorothy was a widow, her husband James having passed from a heart attack 4 years ago, leaving her alone in the house they'd bought in 1987 when Chicago's South Side was still affordable for black families with steady incomes and big dreams. She'd raised 3 children in this house, had been active in her church Mount Zion Baptist for 40 years, volunteered at the food pantry every Saturday, was known in her neighborhood as the woman who still baked sweet potato pies for every community gathering and who never forgot a child's name even years after teaching them. Her body carried the weight of 6 decades, arthritis in her knees and hands that made mornings difficult, high blood pressure medication she took religiously, reading glasses she needed for everything now, but her mind was sharp and her spirit unbroken by a lifetime of navigating America while black, of witnessing segregation in her Alabama childhood, of marching for voting rights in her 20s, of teaching black children their worth in schools that didn't always value them. Living with Dorothy was her granddaughter Amara, 13 years old and about to graduate high school in 2 months, a girl who'd come to live with her grandmother 5 years ago after Amara's mother, Dorothy's daughter Lisa, had spiraled into addiction that made her unable to parent, And Dorothy had stepped in without hesitation because that's what you did for family. You showed up when they needed you. Amara and Dorothy had become inseparable in those 5 years, more like mother and daughter than grandmother and granddaughter, sharing morning coffee and evening news, Amara helping Dorothy with technology while Dorothy taught Amara how to make cornbread from scratch and navigate a world that would judge her harshly for being a young black woman. They had Friday movie nights where they watched old films and Dorothy would pause them to explain historical context, had Sunday afternoon cooking sessions where recipes passed down through generations got made with love and laughter, and Amara had learned from her grandmother what dignity looked like, what pride meant, how to hold your head high when the world tried to make you feel small. This trip mattered to both of them because Aunt Patricia was Amara's favorite relative after Dorothy, the aunt who sent care packages during finals week and called to check on Amara's college applications, who'd promised to help pay for books when Amara started at Howard University in the fall, and the thought of losing her felt unbearable to both women. That morning they'd packed quickly, Dorothy moving slowly because of her arthritis but methodically, making sure they had phone chargers and snacks and the medications she couldn't miss, while Amara handled the online check-in and printed the boarding passes, both of them moving with the efficiency of people who'd learned to navigate crisis together. The Uber to O'Hare took 40 minutes through early morning Chicago traffic, Dorothy and Amara mostly quiet, holding hands in the back seat, Dorothy praying silently while Amara texted updates to family members who were tracking their journey. Check-in at the United counter had been smooth, the agent processing their IDs and confirmation numbers with professional efficiency, smiling and wishing them a good flight, and security was normal, TSA agents waving them through after standard screening, no issues, no problems, just 2 travelers among thousands moving through the airport's morning rush. They'd found gate C-14 with an hour before boarding, settled into uncomfortable chairs near the windows, and Dorothy had called the hospital to check on Patricia while Amara got them coffee, black for Dorothy and too sweet for Amara the way she liked it, and for those quiet minutes before boarding began everything felt manageable, felt like they'd make it to Atlanta and be there when Patricia needed them most. Then Jennifer Walsh had arrived for her shift, this white woman in her 40s with blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful and eyes that scanned the gate area with the expression of someone looking for problems rather than passengers. And Dorothy had noticed the way Jennifer's gaze lingered on her and Amara, had felt that familiar prickle of awareness that comes from 6 decades of recognizing when white people are assessing your right to exist in shared spaces. When boarding for their flight to Atlanta was called, when Dorothy and Amara approached the counter with boarding passes ready, Jennifer had looked at them with an expression that shifted from professional neutrality to something harder, something that made Dorothy's stomach clench with warning before a single word had been spoken. "Step forward," Jennifer had said, her tone already carrying an edge that didn't match the polite efficiency she'd used with the white family who'd boarded before them. "I need to verify your tickets," and the way she said verify made it clear this wasn't standard procedure but targeted scrutiny. Dorothy had handed over her phone showing their mobile boarding passes, had smiled and said good morning in that respectful tone black women of her generation had perfected as survival strategy, and Jennifer had examined the passes with exaggerated thoroughness, zooming in and scrolling and frowning like she was searching for evidence of something criminal rather than just scanning standard airline documentation. And then her face had twisted with what looked like triumph, like she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for, and she'd said those words that would change everything: "These tickets are fake." Jennifer Walsh held Dorothy's phone displaying the mobile boarding passes with one hand while her other hand typed rapidly on her computer keyboard, her face arranged in an expression of theatrical concern that barely masked the satisfaction underneath. And after what felt like an eternity of performative verification, she looked up and said with false regret, "These tickets are definitely fraudulent. The confirmation numbers don't match our system records. The payment method shows irregularities. And I'm going to have to deny boarding and report this to airport authorities for investigation of travel document fraud." The accusation hung in the air heavy and damning, transforming Dorothy and Amara from travelers into criminals in the span of a sentence, and Dorothy felt her legs go weak with the injustice of it because every word Jennifer spoke was a lie, every claim contradicted by the documentation Dorothy had carefully prepared, by the legitimate purchase she'd made 3 days ago that had depleted her checking account but gotten her the tickets she needed to reach her dying sister. "That's not true," Dorothy said, her voice shaking but trying to maintain composure. trying to give this woman the benefit of doubt even as evidence mounted that no benefit was deserved. I have the confirmation email right here from United Airlines. I have my credit card statement showing the exact charge. I have the receipt. Everything matches. Please just look at what I'm showing you and you'll see these tickets are completely legitimate. She held out her phone again, displaying the email trail, the official United Airlines correspondence with logos and booking references and every marker of authenticity. But Jennifer didn't even glance at the screen, just waved it away like Dorothy was offering garbage instead of proof, and said with condescending patience, "Ma'am, I've already told you those documents are fraudulent. Showing me more fake paperwork doesn't make your tickets real. Now you need to step away from my counter so I can board the legitimate passengers who have actual tickets." The word legitimate landed like a slap, the implication clear that Dorothy and Amara were illegitimate in every sense, their tickets fake, their presence unwelcome, their very existence at this gate an offense that needed correcting, and Amara stepped forward with the kind of controlled fury that comes from watching someone you love be degraded. Her 13-year-old voice steady despite the rage underneath as she said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, you haven't actually verified anything. Looked at our boarding passes for 10 seconds and declared them fake without checking your computer system, without calling anyone to confirm, without doing any actual investigation. You just decided we were criminals and now you're refusing to look at evidence that proves otherwise. That's not protocol, that's profiling." The logic was irrefutable, the argument solid, but logic and evidence don't matter when someone has already decided your guilt based on the color of your skin, when the verdict comes before the trial and the trial is just theater to justify predetermined punishment. Jennifer's face flushed red with anger at being challenged, at having her authority questioned by a black teenager who should have known her place, and her voice rose to a volume that carried throughout the gate area, turning their confrontation into a spectacle that drew every eye. "Don't you dare accuse me of profiling. I am doing my job. I am protecting this airline from fraud, and the problem here isn't my verification process. The problem is you people always trying to game the system. Always looking for ways to get something you didn't pay for, always expecting special treatment and crying racism when you get caught. The phrase you people dripped with venom, with decades of coded language that everyone understood even when the specific slur wasn't spoken, and Dorothy felt tears burning in her eyes because she was 60 years old and had thought maybe by now she'd earned the right to be treated as an individual rather than as a representative of every stereotype white supremacy had ever invented about black people. "We're not trying to get anything we didn't pay for," Dorothy said through tears she couldn't hold back anymore, her voice breaking with the exhaustion of having to defend her basic humanity to a stranger with a name tag and a power trip. "I paid full price for these tickets. For $178 I charged to my Visa card. I have the documentation. I have the email confirmations. I have everything you could possibly need to verify legitimacy, and all I'm asking is that you actually look at what I'm showing you instead of just assuming we're criminals because we're black women trying to get to a family emergency." The word black hung in the air, making explicit what had been implicit, naming the thing everyone could see but most people pretended not to notice, and Jennifer's eyes narrowed with the kind of rage that comes from having your prejudice exposed, from being forced to acknowledge what you'd prefer to keep hidden behind professional language and policy justifications. "I don't care what color you are," Jennifer said, the lie so transparent it would have been funny if it wasn't devastating. "I care that you're trying to board my flight with fake tickets, and your constant accusations and your attitude are just making this situation worse. Now I've been patient with you but my patience has run out. You need to leave this gate area immediately or I'm calling security to remove you." Other passengers throughout the waiting area watched with expressions ranging from discomfort to curiosity to what looked disturbingly like approval, phones out recording every moment of Dorothy's humiliation, capturing evidence that would later circulate online with commentary and outrage. But in this moment, in the time when intervention could have mattered, producing only silence, only the passive documentation of suffering without the active protection that two women desperately needed. Dorothy looked at Amara, whose young face showed devastation mixing with determination, looked at the other passengers who'd witnessed this entire exchange and done nothing, looked back at Jennifer Walsh, who held all the power and clearly planned to use it to inflict maximum harm, and she felt something breaking inside her, some faith in fairness, some belief that doing everything right would protect you from cruelty. "My sister is dying," Dorothy whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of all her grief and fear. She's in a hospital in Atlanta and I need to get to her. Please, I'm begging you. Just check the tickets properly, call United's customer service. Do something besides just assuming we're lying. Jennifer picked up her radio, her face showing triumph rather than compassion, and said into the receiver, I need security at gate C14 immediately. I have 2 passengers refusing to leave after being denied boarding for fraudulent documentation. They're becoming increasingly aggressive and I need them removed from the gate area. The word aggressive coming from Jennifer's mouth felt like an additional violence because Dorothy and Amara had been nothing except calm and respectful despite being accused of crimes they hadn't committed, despite having their documentation dismissed without examination, despite being treated like criminals while trying to reach a family member in crisis, and the lie was so blatant, so easily disproven by the dozens of witnesses with phone footage, but Jennifer spoke it with the confidence of someone who knew that her word as a white authority figure would be believed over the protests of 2 black women regardless of what reality actually looked like. Dorothy felt her hands trembling uncontrollably now, the physical manifestation of stress and fear and powerlessness, and she clutched her phone tighter trying to ground herself in something solid, something real, but the evidence on that screen meant nothing to Jennifer who'd already decided guilt and was just performing the motions of justification. We're not being aggressive, Amara said, her voice rising with desperation she could no longer contain. We're standing here asking you to do your job properly, asking you to actually verify our tickets instead of just declaring them fake based on nothing, and the only person being aggressive here is you with your accusations and your racial profiling and your refusal to look at documentation that proves we're telling the truth. She held up her own phone showing the same boarding passes, the same confirmation numbers, the same paper trail of legitimate purchase, and she said with the kind of clarity that comes from fury turned into focus, these tickets were purchased on March 19th at 11:37 p.m. using my grandmother's Visa card ending in 4429. The charge was $478.12. The confirmation number is JKBR73. All of this information is verifiable in United system. If you would just take 30 seconds to actually check instead of assuming we're criminals. Jennifer's face twisted with something that looked like hatred at being contradicted so thoroughly, at having her narrative challenged by a teenager armed with facts and technology, and she said with a sneer that made her contempt visible, "Oh, so now you're going to tell me how to do my job. A child is going to lecture me about airline procedures when I've been working this position for 15 years? That's rich? That's exactly the kind of entitled attitude I was talking about. Thinking you no better than trained professionals. Thinking rules don't apply to you." The deflection was masterful in its dishonesty, transforming Amara's legitimate request for proper verification into some kind of insubordination, making the demand for basic fairness sound like unreasonable arrogance, and other passengers shifted uncomfortably but still said nothing, still chose their comfort over 2 women's dignity, still decided that not getting involved was somehow a neutral position instead of what it really was, which was complicity. Dorothy tried one more time, pulling from reserves of patience she didn't know she still had, her voice soft and pleading in a way that hurt Amara to hear because her grandmother shouldn't have to beg for the basic respect of having her tickets checked properly. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job. I'm just asking you to please call United's customer service line, give them our confirmation number. They can verify in their system that these tickets are legitimate. It will take maybe 2 minutes, and then if there really is a problem we'll deal with it. But if the tickets are valid like I know they are, then we can board and get to my sister who needs us." The reasonableness of the request made its denial even more cruel, made it crystal clear that this wasn't about tickets or verification or airline policy but about Jennifer Walsh wielding power over people she decided didn't deserve to be treated as human. "I'm not calling anyone," Jennifer said with finality, her arms crossing over her chest in a gesture of closed-off authority. "I've made my assessment based on my training and experience, and I'm telling you those tickets are fraudulent. Now the fact that you're trying to pressure me and manipulate me and use emotional stories about sick relatives, that's exactly the kind of tactic people use when they're trying to get away with something, and I'm not falling for it." The accusation that Dorothy was lying about her sister's emergency, that Patricia's shattered knee and post-surgical infection were manipulation tactics rather than the terrifying reality driving this entire desperate journey, made something crack in Dorothy's composure and she started crying harder, her body shaking with sobs that came from someplace deep and broken. From the place where she'd stored 60 years' worth of having to prove her humanity to people determined not to see it. "Please," Dorothy whispered through tears, "please, my sister is alone in the hospital. I just need to get to her. Why are you doing this to us? What did we do to deserve this treatment?" And the raw pain in her voice should have moved anyone with functioning empathy, should have triggered some response besides cruelty, but Jennifer's face remained impassive, unmoved by suffering she'd deliberately created. "Security is on their way," Jennifer said, checking her watch with theatrical impatience, "and when they arrive you're going to be escorted from this gate, and depending on their assessment you might be facing charges for attempting to board with fraudulent documents, which is a federal offense. So I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to explain this to the authorities instead of wasting my time with your stories." The threat of federal charges, of criminal prosecution, of consequences that could follow Dorothy for the rest of her life, landed like a physical blow, and Amara wrapped her arms around her grandmother who was crying so hard now she could barely stand, her arthritic knees buckling under the weight of injustice and fear, and Amara felt rage building in her chest like a fire that needed oxygen, needed release, needed to burn through the silence that surrounded them like a cage. If you're watching this and you've ever filmed injustice instead of stopping it, if you've ever told yourself it wasn't your business when someone needed help, then subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being different, because what happens next when this 13-year-old girl decides she's done being silent will show you what courage looks like, and your comfort is not worth more than these women's dignity. A businessman 3 seats away met Amara's eyes for just a second, long enough for her to see guilt there, long enough for him to look away in shame, but not long enough for him to actually speak up, to use his voice or his privilege or his witness to say this is wrong, stop this now. The sound of heavy boots on airport tile announced security's arrival, 2 officers in uniform walking toward gate C-14 with expressions already arranged into assumptions about who was causing problems. The 2 security officers who arrived at gate C-14 were both white men in their 30s, one tall and broad-shouldered with a crew cut that suggested military background, the other shorter and stockier with the kind of face that had probably been described as friendly before years of airport security work had hardened it into professional suspicion, and they approached the counter where Jennifer Walsh stood with her arms still crossed looking vindicated, where Dorothy leaned against Amara for support because her legs felt too weak to hold her weight anymore, and the officer's eyes swept over the scene with a practiced assessment of people trained to identify threats, landing on 2 crying black women and 1 confident white gate agent and making calculations that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with who they were predisposed to believe. "What's the situation here?" the taller officer asked Jennifer, his hand resting casually on his belt near the radio and other equipment that marked his authority, his tone suggesting he was asking out of procedure rather than genuine uncertainty because he'd clearly already decided who was in the wrong based on nothing except racial dynamics and professional courtesy between people wearing uniforms. Jennifer launched into her version of events with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for lying. "These 2 passengers attempted to board Flight 1847 to Atlanta with fraudulent tickets. I verified the documentation and determined the boarding passes were fake. They became aggressive and refused to leave the gate area when I denied them boarding. They've been harassing me for the past 15 minutes, making wild accusations and causing a disturbance that's delaying departure for legitimate passengers." Every sentence was a distortion or outright fabrication, every word designed to paint Dorothy and Amara as the aggressors rather than the victims. And Amara felt fury rising in her throat, hot enough to burn because this woman was lying to armed security officers, was weaponizing their authority to punish 2 women whose only crime was existing while black in a space Jennifer had decided they didn't belong in. "That's not true," Amara said, her voice loud enough to carry despite the trembling underneath. "We showed her our legitimate tickets. We offered confirmation emails and credit card statements and receipts. We asked her multiple times to verify through United System. She refused to look at any evidence and just declared our tickets fake without doing any actual investigation. We've been nothing except polite, and she's been hurling racial slurs and treating us like criminals for no reason." The shorter officer held up one hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be calming but felt dismissive. "Okay, everyone just calm down. We're going to sort this out. Now can I see the tickets in question and some identification from both of you?" Dorothy fumbled with her phone, her arthritic fingers struggling with the screen through her tears, and she pulled up the boarding passes while Amara handed over both their driver's licenses, and the officer examined everything with what looked like thoroughness, but Amara could see his eyes weren't really processing the information, weren't actually checking whether the confirmation numbers matched or the names aligned or any of the verification that would prove their legitimacy. He was just going through motions before siding with Jennifer because that's what the power structure demanded. That's what his training and his prejudices and his comfort all aligned to require. These boarding passes, the officer said slowly, looking at Jennifer rather than Dorothy, "You're saying these don't match your system records?" And Jennifer nodded with exaggerated certainty, saying, "That's correct. I ran multiple checks and these confirmation numbers don't exist in our database. These are fraudulent documents that were likely purchased through illegal channels or created using stolen information." The lie was so blatant, so easily verifiable as false if anyone would just call United's customer service or check the actual system, but the officer accepted it without question, without even attempting independent verification, because a white woman in an airline uniform said it, and that carried more weight than any amount of documentation two black women could provide. "Officer, please," Dorothy said, her voice breaking with desperation that made Amara's heart physically hurt. "Please just call United Airlines customer service. Call them right now and give them our confirmation number. They can tell you in 30 seconds that these tickets are real, that we paid for them, that we have every right to board this flight. My sister is in the hospital and I need to get to her. Please don't let this woman's lies keep me from my family." The pleading in her grandmother's voice, the way Dorothy was begging armed men to simply verify the truth before destroying her chance to reach Patricia, made Amara want to scream because her grandmother was 60 years old and had spent a lifetime earning dignity through service and kindness and contribution, and here she was reduced to begging strangers to believe her over someone who'd lied from the first moment. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," the taller officer said in a tone that suggested he didn't understand anything except the script he'd been given for dealing with difficult passengers, "but we have to take the gate agent's professional assessment seriously. She's trained to identify fraudulent documents, and if she says these tickets are fake, then we need to treat this as a potential criminal matter. Now you can either leave the gate area voluntarily or we're going to have to escort you out. Those are your options." The false choice was designed to make their removal seem reasonable, seem like something they were choosing rather than something being forced upon them, and Amara saw her grandmother's face crumple with the understanding that no amount of truth or evidence or pleading was going to matter, that the decision had been made before the officers even arrived. "We're not leaving," Amara heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere brave and possibly foolish. "We have legitimate tickets and we're not criminals, and you have no right to remove us without actually verifying whether the gate agent's accusations are true. Check the tickets properly, call the airline, do your actual job instead of just taking her word for it because she's white and we're black." The racial element made explicit seemed to shift something in the air, made the other passengers lean in with uncomfortable recognition, made the officers' faces harden with the defensiveness that comes when prejudice gets named, and the taller officer's hand moved from his belt to a position that suggested he was preparing for physical intervention. "You need to calm down and lower your voice," he said, his tone taking on an edge of warning. "You're creating a disturbance, and if you don't comply with our instructions, we're going to have to take additional measures. Now I'm going to ask you one more time to gather your belongings and leave this gate area peacefully." But there was nothing peaceful about what was happening, nothing voluntary about compliance extracted through threat of force, and when Dorothy tried to take a step toward the officer to plead one more time, when her arthritic knee buckled slightly and she stumbled, the officer grabbed her arm with force that made her cry out in pain. "Don't touch my grandmother," Amara screamed, lunging forward to protect Dorothy, but the shorter officer blocked her path and suddenly both officers had hands on both women, gripping arms and shoulders with the kind of force that left marks. The taller officer's grip on Dorothy's arm tightened with enough pressure to make her gasp, his fingers digging into flesh already tender from arthritis, and he said in a voice that had shifted from professional to aggressive, "Ma'am, you need to stop resisting and come with us right now. You're being removed from this gate for attempting to board with fraudulent documents and creating a disturbance. If you continue to resist, we'll have no choice but to restrain you, and you could face additional charges." The word restrain conjured images of handcuffs and force and public degradation beyond what they were already experiencing, and Dorothy felt terror mixing with her grief because she was 60 years old with bad knees and high blood pressure, and the thought of being physically restrained by men half her age felt like a violence her body might not survive, like the kind of encounter that ended with black people in hospitals or worse. "I'm not resisting," Dorothy said through sobs that made speech difficult, her whole body shaking now with fear and pain and the injustice of being treated like a criminal when her only crime was buying plane tickets while black. "Please don't hurt me. I'll leave. I'll go wherever you want. Just please don't hurt me." And the pleading in her voice, the terror of a grandmother begging for mercy from people who'd shown no capacity for it, made something inside Amara crack and rebuild into something harder, something that refused to watch her grandmother be brutalized without fighting back, even if fighting back meant making things worse. "Let her go," Amara shouted, her voice carrying across the gate area with enough force that conversations stopped and heads turned. "She hasn't done anything wrong. You're hurting her. Look at her, she's terrified and in pain, and all we did was try to board a flight with legitimate tickets. This is abuse. This is assault. Someone needs to stop this." But nobody stopped it. Nobody moved to intervene. The other passengers just watched with their phones out, documenting Dorothy's suffering while doing nothing to prevent it, and the shorter officer grabbed Amara's arm, pulling her away from her grandmother, his grip firm enough to immobilize but not quite painful enough to justify calling it brutality, though it felt brutal anyway. Felt like being held in place while someone you love gets hurt. "You need to calm down and stop interfering," the officer said to Amara, his breath warm on her face as he leaned close. "You're making this harder on your grandmother by escalating the situation. Now we're going to escort both of you out of this gate area, and you can either walk peacefully or we can carry you, but either way you're leaving." The officers started moving Dorothy toward the exit, one on each side gripping her arms, and she could barely walk because her knees were bad and her whole body was shaking and the terror had made her weak. So they were essentially dragging her, this 60-year-old black woman, being hauled away from a gate while dozens of witnesses filmed and whispered but didn't speak up, didn't say this is wrong, didn't use their voices or their privilege or their basic humanity to protect someone who desperately needed protecting. Dorothy's feet scraped against the airport carpet, her sensible shoes that she'd worn because they were comfortable for travel now catching and sliding as the officers pulled her forward with mechanical efficiency, treating her like an object to be moved rather than a person experiencing trauma, and she cried out when her bad knee twisted painfully, the sound raw and animal and heartbreaking. "Stop hurting her," Amara screamed again, thrashing against the officer who held her back. "Can't you see she can barely walk? She has arthritis. She's 60 years old. What is wrong with you people? How can you do this to someone's grandmother?" And her voice broke on the word grandmother because that's what Dorothy was. Not a criminal, not a threat. Just a grandmother trying to get to her sister's hospital bed and being treated like she was dangerous, like she deserved this brutality. The other passengers in the gate area watched with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable pity to righteous approval, some clearly thinking Dorothy must have done something to deserve this treatment because authority figures wouldn't remove someone without cause, others recognizing the injustice but choosing silence anyway, choosing not to get involved, choosing their flight schedules and their comfort over the moral obligation to intervene when witnessing cruelty. A middle-aged white woman in business attire actually shook her head and muttered to her companion they should have just left when they were told to, her voice loud enough for Amara to hear, loud enough to communicate that she believed compliance with unjust orders was more important than fighting discrimination, that black people should accept mistreatment gracefully rather than resist and make scenes that inconvenienced others. The casual victim blaming, the ease with which this stranger decided Dorothy deserved what was happening to her, made Amara feel a rage so pure it was almost clarifying, almost useful, the kind of anger that could be channeled into action if she could just figure out what action might possibly matter against a system designed to protect people like Jennifer Walsh and punish people like her grandmother. Dorothy's purse fell from her shoulder as the officers dragged her past row after row of seats, the contents spilling across the floor, reading glasses and medication bottles and the small notebook where she kept phone numbers written in her careful handwriting, and nobody bent to help gather her belongings. Nobody offered even that small kindness. They just stepped around the scattered items like they were trash instead of the personal effects of a woman being publicly humiliated. Amara tried to break free from the officer holding her to retrieve her grandmother's things, but his grip tightened painfully and he said, "Leave it. You can get your stuff later. Right now you need to keep moving," and the callousness of that order, The assumption that Dorothy's belongings were less important than the efficiency of her removal felt like another small violence added to the larger brutality. They reached the edge of the gate area, the boundary between the waiting zone and the main terminal, and the officers paused there as if uncertain how far to take this removal, whether to just leave Dorothy and Amara in the corridor or escort them further, perhaps all the way out of the secure area through TSA and back to public space where they'd have to go through security again if they somehow managed to resolve this nightmare and get new tickets. Dorothy sagged between the officers, her legs giving out completely now, and they held her up by her arms in a way that looked painful, in a way that made Amara think about all the videos she'd seen of police brutality, of black people being manhandled and brutalized and sometimes killed by officers who saw them as threats instead of humans. "Please," Dorothy whispered one more time, her voice so quiet Amara barely heard it. "Please, I just need to get to my sister. Please don't take this away from me." And the broken pleading in those words, the complete powerlessness of a woman who'd done everything right and was still being punished, made Amara understand with absolute clarity that begging wouldn't work, that appealing to mercy or fairness or human decency wouldn't change anything because the people hurting them had already decided. They didn't deserve mercy or fairness or decency. Jennifer Walsh stood back at the gate counter watching the removal with visible satisfaction, her face showing the triumph of someone who'd wielded power successfully and enjoyed the results. And Amara looked at her and felt something shift, felt a decision crystallizing in her mind about what needed to happen next. Amara watched her grandmother being dragged away from the gate, watched Dorothy's medication bottles rolling across the airport carpet ignored by everyone, watched the officers treating a 60-year-old woman with arthritis like she was a dangerous criminal, and something inside her that had been taught to be polite, to be quiet, to not make scenes or draw attention or cause trouble, that something shattered completely and was replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a weapon she could finally use. She wrenched her arm free from the officer holding her with enough force that he stumbled backward surprised, and before he could grab her again she planted herself directly in the middle of the corridor, her body blocking the path between the gate and the terminal, her hands reaching into her pocket to pull out her phone with movements fast enough that the officer couldn't stop her without tackling her, which he clearly wasn't willing to do in front of all these witnesses with their cameras. "Stop," Amara said, her voice loud enough to echo through the gate area and down the corridor, loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of airport announcements and rolling luggage and hushed conversations. "Everyone stop what you're doing right now and look at what's happening here. Look at how they're treating my grandmother. Look at this racism happening in real time while all of you stand there and watch." She held up her phone, fingers swiping to open Instagram and then TikTok, her thumb hovering over the live button while her eyes swept across the dozens of passengers who'd been filming passively, who'd been documenting without intervening, and she said with a fury that made her voice shake, "You want to film this? You want content for your social media? Then I'm going to give you content. I'm going to show the entire world what happens when a black grandmother tries to visit her dying sister and gets called a criminal by a racist gate agent who won't even check if the accusations are true." Amara pressed the live button and watched the viewer count start at 0, then jump to 5, then 15, then 40 as her followers got notifications and started tuning in, and she turned the camera to show the security officers still gripping her grandmother, to show Dorothy's tear-streaked face and shaking body, to show the undeniable reality of an elderly woman being brutalized. "This is my grandmother Dorothy Freeman," Amara said into the camera, her voice steadying as she found her rhythm, as the anger transformed into something focused and powerful. "She's 60 years old, she has arthritis and high blood pressure. She's trying to get to Atlanta because her sister had emergency surgery that went wrong and is alone in a hospital bed asking for family. We bought legitimate tickets 3 days ago. We have receipts and confirmation emails and credit card statements proving. We paid for these seats, but the gate agent at United Airlines Gate C-14 in Chicago O'Hare decided we were criminals the second she saw our black faces." The viewer count was climbing rapidly now, 100, 200, 500, people tuning in and sharing and commenting, and Amara could see the chat filling with outraged messages, with people demanding to know what was happening, with others saying they were calling the airline, calling corporate, calling news stations. "The gate agent Jennifer Walsh," Amara continued, turning the camera toward Jennifer, who was now looking less triumphant and more uncertain as she realized this was being broadcast live, "declared our tickets fake without checking them, refused to look at our documentation, called us racial slurs, told us we don't belong here. And when we asked her to verify through United System, she called security, and now they're dragging my grandmother away, hurting her, treating her like a criminal while every single person in this airport watches and does nothing. The officer holding Dorothy said something sharp about putting the phone away, about interfering with security operations, but Amara ignored him and turned the camera on the other passengers, panning across their uncomfortable faces, their averted eyes, their phones still recording but their mouths still silent. "Look at all these witnesses," Amara said, her voice carrying the weight of accusation. "Look at all these people who are watching racism happen and choosing to film instead of speak up, choosing their comfort over my grandmother's safety, choosing to be bystanders instead of using their privilege to say this is wrong. Stop this now." And I want everyone watching this live stream to understand that this is how racism survives in 2025, not because of people like Jennifer Walsh alone, but because of all these silent witnesses who let it happen. The viewer count hit 1,000, then 2,000, the comments flooding in faster than Amara could read them, people tagging United Airlines, tagging civil rights organizations, tagging news outlets, the viral momentum building in real time as the algorithm picked up on engagement and pushed the stream to more feeds. "My grandmother worked as a teacher for 38 years, Amara continued, fighting through tears that threatened to choke her words. She taught black children in Chicago public schools that they mattered, that they had value, that education could protect them, and now she's being dragged away from an airport gate because a racist woman decided her tickets were fake without even checking, because security officers believed a white woman's lies over a black woman's documented truth, because this is what America still does to black people who dare to exist in spaces white supremacy wants to keep for itself." Dorothy looked up at Amara with an expression mixing pride and terror, pride that her granddaughter was fighting back but terror about what consequences that fight might bring, and she tried to say something but her voice was too weak, too broken by crying and fear. The officers seemed uncertain now, aware that their actions were being broadcast to thousands of people, that their handling of this situation was being scrutinized in ways that body cam footage never quite captured. And the taller one spoke into his radio requesting supervisor assistance, his face showing the beginning of understanding that maybe this situation wasn't as simple as a gate agent had made it seem. "And to everyone in this airport who's watching this happen in person," Amara said, turning the camera back on herself so viewers could see the tears on her face, the fury and heartbreak mixed together, "you should be ashamed, you should feel the weight of your silence, because my grandmother is someone's sister, someone's mother, someone's friend. She's a human being who deserves dignity, and you're letting her be degraded because it's easier than speaking up." The livestream viewer count exploded past 5,000 in a matter of minutes, the numbers climbing so fast Amara could barely process them. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people watching in real time as she held her phone steady despite her shaking hands and continued speaking truth to an audience that was growing exponentially with every share and retweet and notification. "United Airlines," Amara said directly into the camera, her voice gaining strength from the visible support flooding the comments. "Your employee Jennifer Walsh at Gate C14 is right now committing a civil rights violation. She racially profiled my grandmother and me, declared our legitimate tickets fraudulent without verification, and called security to physically remove a 60-year-old woman with arthritis from your gate. And all of this is happening because we're black. That's the only reason. We did everything right and we're still being treated like criminals." The comments section was on fire now, people tagging at United in angry messages, demanding accountability, sharing the stream to their own followers, and Amara could see the ripple effect happening in real time as the story spread across platforms, Instagram to Twitter to TikTok to Facebook, each platform's algorithm picking up on the engagement and amplifying the reach. A young black woman 3 gates down who'd been watching on her phone suddenly stood up and walked over, her voice loud enough to carry as she said, "I'm a witness. I saw everything. That gate agent was aggressive and racist from the beginning. These women did nothing wrong." And her intervention seemed to break something in the collective paralysis because suddenly other voices joined in. A Latino man saying, "I recorded the whole thing on my phone and it's exactly like she's describing," an elderly white couple saying, "We've been sitting here watching this injustice and we should have spoken up sooner." The security supervisor who'd been called arrived jogging down the corridor, a black woman in her 50s whose face registered immediate concern when she saw Dorothy being held by two officers while a teenager live-streamed to thousands. And she said with authority that cut through the chaos, "What's the situation here? Why is this passenger being detained?" And the taller officer started to explain about fraudulent tickets and gate agent orders, but the supervisor held up one hand, cutting him off, and said, "I want to see the actual tickets, and I want to hear from the passengers themselves what happened." Amara turned the camera toward the supervisor, zooming in on her name tag that read Supervisor Michelle Carter, and said into the live stream, "Okay, everyone, this is the supervisor. Let's see if United Airlines actually cares about doing the right thing or if they're going to double down on racism." And the challenge was clear: the accountability public, the stakes raised by tens of thousands of witnesses. Dorothy, with shaking hands, pulled up the boarding passes on her phone again, showed them to Supervisor Carter along with the confirmation emails and credit card statements she'd been trying to show Jennifer Walsh for the past 30 minutes. And Carter examined everything with actual thoroughness, her eyes moving between the phone screen and her own tablet, her fingers typing and swiping. And after what felt like an eternity but was probably 90 seconds, she looked up with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal anger. "These tickets are completely legitimate," Supervisor Carter said loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "Purchased on March 19th, paid in full, properly confirmed in our system. There is absolutely no issue with this documentation. These passengers should have been boarded without question." And she turned to the officers and said, "Release them immediately. They've done nothing wrong and shouldn't have been detained in the first place." The officers let go of Dorothy, who nearly collapsed without their support, and Amara rushed forward to catch her grandmother, wrapping her arms around Dorothy's shaking frame while keeping the phone camera active, and the live stream captured the moment of reunion, grandmother and granddaughter holding each other while thousands watched and commented and shared. The viewer count had passed 30,000 now, the story trending on multiple platforms, and Amara could see through her tears that major news outlets were starting to pick it up, verified accounts commenting and requesting permission to use the footage, the viral momentum becoming unstoppable. "Where is the gate agent who initiated this?" Supervisor Carter demanded, her voice carrying the weight of someone who knew heads were about to roll and was ready to make sure the right ones did. "I need to speak with her immediately." And Jennifer Walsh, who'd been watching from the gate counter with growing alarm, tried to slip away, but Carter called out, "Jennifer Walsh, you stay right there. Don't move. We're going to have a very serious conversation about what just happened here." The crowd of passengers had grown as people from neighboring gates migrated over to see what the commotion was about, some recognizing the viral live stream they'd been watching on their phones was happening right in front of them, and they formed a loose circle around the scene, bearing witness in person to what millions were now witnessing online. "Airport authority is responding," Amara narrated for her audience, her voice still shaking but victorious. "They verified our tickets are real, just like we said from the beginning, just like Jennifer Walsh could have done 30 minutes ago instead of calling us criminals and having my grandmother dragged away. And now she's going to face consequences, and everyone watching this needs to understand that this is what happens when you don't stay silent, when you force them to answer in public where they can't hide behind closed-door investigations and internal processes that protect racist employees." The comments were flooding with support and outrage in equal measure, people demanding Jennifer Walsh be fired, demanding the security officers be disciplined, demanding United Airlines make a public statement and implement policy changes, the collective voice of accountability growing louder with every passing second. Supervisor Carter was on her radio now, her face grim as she spoke in urgent tones to what sounded like higher-level management, and Amara caught fragments of the conversation. "Viral live stream with 30,000 viewers, major PR crisis, need executive involvement immediately, all flights at risk if we don't handle this right." The mention of all flights caught Amara's attention, and she leaned closer to hear Carter say, "We need to implement full gate protocol review. Every agent on shift needs temporary suspension until we can verify there aren't other incidents happening. This is bigger than one gate. This is a systemic issue that's being exposed in real time." Within 15 minutes of Amara's livestream going viral, the entire atmosphere of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal C shifted from normal operations to visible crisis management, airport executives in dark suits appearing with tablets and urgent expressions. Huddles forming near gate counters where management consulted in hushed tones while glancing nervously at the growing crowd around gate C14 where Amara still held her phone broadcasting to over 50,000 live viewers and counting. The numbers kept climbing, the story spreading across every platform, hashtags trending worldwide, United Airlines mentioned in hundreds of thousands of posts demanding accountability, and Amara could feel the power of collective voice in a way she'd never experienced before, the understanding that silence could be broken not just by speaking but by amplifying that speech until it couldn't be ignored. An announcement crackled through the terminal speaker system, the voice tense with barely controlled damage control. Ladies and gentlemen, we are temporarily suspending all boarding procedures at all gates in Terminal C while we conduct an urgent operational review. We apologize for this inconvenience and appreciate your patience. Further updates will be provided as soon as possible. The collective groan from hundreds of passengers rippled through the terminal, people checking their watches and phones, some pulling up the viral live stream to understand why their flights were being delayed, connecting the dots between the chaos at gate C14 and the system-wide shutdown, and Amara narrated for her audience, "You're hearing that right. United Airlines just grounded every single flight in this terminal. They stopped all operations because this story is going so viral they can't afford to let business continue as usual while racism gets exposed." Dorothy sat in a wheelchair that someone had brought, her body still shaking from the trauma of being dragged and detained, and a paramedic knelt beside her checking her blood pressure and asking questions about her medications while Amara kept one hand on her grandmother's shoulder and the other holding the phone steady. The chat was filled with people asking if Dorothy was okay, expressing concern and outrage, offering to help in whatever ways they could, and Amara said into the camera, "My grandmother's blood pressure is dangerously high, she's been traumatized, she's in pain, and all of this could have been avoided if one gate agent had just done her job properly instead of deciding we were criminals based on our skin color. This is the human cost of racism that statistics don't capture. This is what discrimination does to real people's bodies and hearts." A man in an expensive suit approached, his name tag identifying him as Robert Mitchell, Terminal Operations Director, and he addressed Dorothy with practiced corporate concern that couldn't quite hide the calculation behind it. "Miss Freeman, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what you've experienced today. What happened to you and your granddaughter is completely unacceptable and does not reflect United Airlines values or policies. We are conducting an immediate investigation and taking swift action to ensure this never happens again." The apology sounded rehearsed, optimized for PR rather than genuine remorse, and Amara made sure her live stream captured every word so her audience could judge its sincerity themselves. "Jennifer Walsh has been relieved of duty effective immediately," Mitchell continued, reading from talking points someone had clearly just handed him. "She's being escorted from the premises and will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into her conduct. Additionally, we are implementing temporary suspension of all gate agents currently on shift until we can complete comprehensive reviews of recent passenger interactions to ensure there are no other incidents of discrimination or policy violations." The announcement that every gate agent was being suspended sent shockwaves through the watching crowd, the recognition that Amara's live stream had triggered consequences reaching far beyond one racist employee, that the entire system was being forced to examine itself in ways it clearly hadn't been willing to do before public pressure made inaction impossible. "But temporary suspension isn't enough," Amara said into her camera, her voice steady with the confidence of someone who had 50,000 people backing her up. "Jennifer Walsh needs to be permanently fired, banned from ever working in aviation again, because this isn't the first time she's done this. Our research while standing here shows she's had complaints before, she's targeted other black passengers before, and United Airlines protected her until we forced them to act by making this public. So no, I'm not accepting your apologies until I see real permanent consequences." The viewers responded with floods of agreement, demanding the same accountability Amara was calling for, and Mitchell's face tightened with the understanding that this wasn't going to be resolved with standard corporate damage control. A new gate agent appeared at the counter, a young black woman whose hands shook slightly as she set up her computer, clearly aware that she was being watched by thousands and that her handling of this situation would be scrutinized. And she approached Dorothy with genuine compassion in her eyes, saying, "Miss Freeman, my name is Angela, and I'm going to personally ensure you and your granddaughter get on the next available flight to Atlanta with our deepest apologies. First-class seats, no charge. And I've already contacted the hospital in Atlanta to let them know you're on your way to your sister." The kindness in Angela's voice, the humanity that Jennifer Walsh had refused to show, made Dorothy start crying again, but this time with relief instead of fear. The understanding that maybe this nightmare was finally ending, that maybe she'd actually get to Patricia's bedside. "The flights are resuming," Mitchell announced to the terminal at large, his voice carrying through a borrowed megaphone. "We've completed our initial assessment and boarding will restart momentarily with enhanced oversight. We apologize for the delay and appreciate your patience during this critical operational review." Passengers throughout Terminal C started gathering their belongings, forming lines at gates, the normal rhythm of airport operations trying to reassert itself. But everyone knew things had changed, that what happened at Gate C-14 had exposed something that couldn't be hidden again, that the viral documentation meant there would be no sweeping this under bureaucratic rugs. Amara watched her grandmother being helped gently onto a wheelchair transport, watched airport staff treating Dorothy with the dignity and respect she should have received from the beginning, and she said to her livestream audience, which had peaked at over 70,000 simultaneous viewers, "This is what happens when we refuse to stay silent, when we force them to answer in public, when we use whatever power we have even when it feels small. My grandmother is getting on that flight, Jennifer. Walsh is losing her job, and United Airlines is being forced to examine how many other Jennifer Walshes they've been protecting, all because I hit the live button and you all showed up to witness." Dorothy and Amara boarded Flight 1847 to Atlanta 3 hours later than originally scheduled, seated in first class with seats that felt too luxurious given everything they'd endured to reach them. And as the plane climbed into the evening sky, Dorothy held Amara's hand tight and whispered, "Thank you, baby. Thank you for not letting them make us disappear, for using your voice when mine wasn't enough." And Amara felt tears streaming down her face because the victory felt incomplete, felt like justice that came too late to prevent trauma, that arrived only after her grandmother had been dragged and humiliated and broken in ways that apologies and upgraded seats couldn't fully repair. They landed in Atlanta at 9:30 p.m., rushed through the terminal to catch an Uber to Grady Memorial Hospital, and when they finally reached Patricia's room and Dorothy saw her sister alive despite the infection and complications, the two women held each other and cried with relief that felt bittersweet because they were together, but the journey to get there had cost something neither would fully recover from. The investigation that United Airlines launched lasted 3 weeks, conducted under intense public scrutiny with updates posted regularly because Amara's livestream had generated over 15 million views across platforms and the story had been covered by every major news outlet, making this a case study in viral accountability that the airline couldn't bury even if they'd wanted to. Jennifer Walsh was terminated permanently on day 4 of the investigation after interviews with other passengers revealed a pattern of discriminatory behaviors spanning years, complaints that had been filed and dismissed, black travelers who'd experienced her hostility but hadn't had the platform or the proof to make their stories matter, and the documentation of institutional failure to address racism when it wasn't being broadcast to millions made United's liability clear and devastating. Jennifer Walsh was also banned from working in any aviation capacity at any airport in the United States, her credentials revoked, her name added to industry databases that would flag her if she tried to apply elsewhere. Consequences that felt substantial but somehow still inadequate measured against the harm she'd inflicted not just on Dorothy and Amara but on countless others whose experiences had been invalidated and ignored. The 2 security officers who dragged Dorothy were suspended for 30 days without pay and required to complete bias training, punishment that Amara publicly stated was too lenient, that felt like a compromise designed to protect institutional authority rather than genuinely address the problem of officers who'd chosen to believe a white woman's lies over documented evidence and basic human compassion. United Airlines implemented new mandatory training for all customer-facing employees on implicit bias and de-escalation, created an independent review board for discrimination complaints that couldn't be influenced by individual managers protecting problematic staff, and established a direct reporting line for passengers who experienced profiling or mistreatment, changes that felt like progress but also felt reactive rather than preventive, like policies created to manage PR rather than genuinely transform culture. Dorothy received a settlement from United Airlines, the amount undisclosed but substantial enough to cover her sister's medical bills, and then some money that felt like blood money, like compensation for trauma that no dollar amount could actually heal, but at least acknowledgement that harm had been done and some form of repair was owed. 3 months after the incident, Amara received a call from the NAACP who wanted to honor her with their Youth Activism Award, recognizing her courage in using social media to expose racism and force accountability in real time. And at the ceremony in front of hundreds of people, Amara gave a speech that made national news where she said, "I didn't do anything special. I just refused to be silent when silence would have meant watching my grandmother be destroyed, and every single person in that airport could have done the same thing, could have used their voice, but most of them chose comfort over courage, and that choice is why racism survives, not because of people like Jennifer Walsh alone, but because of everyone who sees it happening and decides it's not their problem." The speech was shared millions of times, became required viewing in high school social studies classes, turned Amara into a symbol of resistance that she never asked to be but accepted because maybe her visibility could inspire others to speak up sooner, to intervene earlier, to refuse complicity. If this story changed you, if it made you think about times you stayed silent when you should have spoken, if you recognize that bystander you've been and want to be different, then subscribe to this channel right now and commit to using your voice next time you witness injustice, because children like Amara shouldn't have to fight these battles alone, grandmothers like Dorothy shouldn't have to beg for basic dignity, and your comfort is not worth more than someone else's humanity, so hit that subscribe button if you believe we can do better. But the truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge in all the celebration of Amara's bravery and all the policy changes and all the viral attention was that Dorothy was never quite the same after that day at O'Hare, that she developed anxiety around airports and travel, that she had nightmares about being dragged away from gates, that the casual cruelty of being called a criminal and treated as less than human had left scars no settlement could heal. Patricia recovered from her knee surgery eventually, but Dorothy visited less frequently than she wanted to because flying triggered panic attacks, because the trauma of that March day had stolen some of her freedom, had made the world feel less safe, had taught her granddaughter lessons about American racism that no 13-year-old should have to learn through lived experience. Jennifer Walsh's termination and ban from aviation felt like justice, but it was justice that came only after Dorothy suffered. Only after Amara had to become an activist to protect her grandmother, only after millions of people witnessed and shared and demanded accountability. And the question that haunted both women in quiet moments was how many other Jennifer Walshes were still working gates at airports across America, still profiling passengers, still wielding authority to inflict harm, still protected by systems that valued institutional comfort over individual dignity, waiting for their own viral moment to expose them, or more likely never being exposed at all because not every victim had a granddaughter brave enough to hit the live button and fight back. This happened because one girl refused to stay silent, but it shouldn't have taken that courage, shouldn't have required that fight, shouldn't have needed millions of witnesses to make basic human decency possible, and that truth, more than any award or settlement or policy change, was what kept Amara awake some nights. The understanding that she'd won one battle, but the war against racism that required her to fight it was far from over.